after soundly defeating the incumbent Civic platform. We're delighted to be back here at Cass Business School. Welcome to all of you and people joining us on the live stream. And we're most grateful as ever, ladies and gentlemen, to Professor Paul Palmer, the rector here at Cass Business School. Professor Palmer.
Good evening, everybody. Warm welcome to Cass. I just want to spend literally 10 seconds just to say that this has been a series of events that we've been very happy to host with Liam and in particular with the proprietor of IntelliNews, Professor Jerome Newton, our visiting faculty, who many people will know. And absolutely his topic of interest. I just wanted to say, anybody who's had, everybody in this room knows much more about this subject. I belong to a club called the Athenaeum, and one of the bylaws of the Athenaeum is that a member knows more about it than you on the subject. And many years ago, I gave a lecture, and I spoke about a particular subject. I particularly talked about a crisis, which was in 1806 in turning the Bishop of Suffolk, only to find that the chap who knocked on the said, "You got that slightly wrong." And it was the current Bishop of Suffolk. So, you're always aware. But I'm just going to be very brave for a moment and say that those of us who have a little study of Polish history, I think this really is a momentous event. I was saying to Jan earlier that I'll leave the question mark at the end. But if you think about the War of the Austrian Succession, the breaking up of Poland, this dissemination really over a period of 15 years during the 18th century, and then its reformulation after the First World War, tragedies that of course occurred in Poland in the Second World War and thereafter until the collapse of the Soviet Union, its re-emergence again. You would have thought that Poles would be, dare I say it, kindred souls with the French and the Germans, and it's the British who are a little bit sort of standoffish, as we know. Not all whatever. But is this a point at which, if you like, there I used the word, and that's why I'm concluding with, discuss, are we at a point where the European dream, in one sense, and it really was a dream, those of us who studied that period after the Second World War, and its formation, is it coming to an end? Is it coming to an end? Is Poland, in this case, probably signifying many of those changes? So, a great event to happen tonight. Back over to you, Liam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you again to Professor Palmer, to Mario Marinescu, who runs the events team here at Cass. Thanks also to my colleague, Henry Kirby, who's put a lot of work into this event tonight as well. So law and justice are back in power in Europe's sixth largest economy, ladies and gentlemen, having previously been in office from 2005 to 2007. In Sunday's election, they took around 37% of the vote, soundly defeating the incumbent Civic platform, who won just over 24%, and the allocation of seats, which I believe is now confirmed. Law and Justice have 235 out of 460 seats in the Sejm, which gives them a slim working majority. Following the victory in May in the presidential election, of course, of Andrzej Duda, a single party will now form Poland's government for the first time since the collapse of communism, and with an absolute majority in Parliament. So the first time since 1989, of course. How does this happen? That's one of the things we're going to discuss here tonight. How did Law and Justice, a party that had generally appealed to primarily older, relatively less educated people in Poland's smaller towns, broaden its electoral appeal? How did it tap into discontent, particularly felt among quite a few younger Poles, that they weren't sharing in what has been one of Europe's, and certainly Eastern Europe's, major economic success stories? What does this victory, ladies and gentlemen, mean for Poland's relationships with the European Union? Law and Justice having a rather, how shall we put it, spiky relationship with Brussels, and having campaigned strongly, of course, against the EU's emergency migrant relocation program. And given that we are here in London, of course, what does Law and Justice's victory mean for the UK's attempts to reform its relationship with the European Union? We have a fantastic panel here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted that they're all here. We have Charles Crawford, who of course was Britain's distinguished ambassador to Moscow. We have to Warsaw. Sorry, Freudian slip. That's where I first met you, of course, in Moscow. You had more hair then. We have Magda Poland, who is Polish from Goldman Sachs, a senior economist. We have Jan Kubik, who is now the director of CEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies here in London. And I'm delighted to welcome Annabelle Chapman, also fresh in from Warsaw, BNE's one of BNE's correspondents in Warsaw. You may have seen on the front of our magazine cover last month her cover story predicting pretty much exactly what has happened. I'm going to start by asking Charles, if I may. Charles, how did this happen? Are you surprised that Law and Justice did as well as they have done with an overall majority in Parliament?
I suppose not really, because I was talking to someone actually the other day in Warsaw about all this, and he said he talked to a top opinion poller, and the top opinion poller said, "Look, we do have telephone polling by telephone these days. 70% of people we phone just put the phone down, and the other 30% may not be telling the truth." So the polls, he said, are not accurate. But it turns out that if you take enough polls, you get an accurate enough result. So I think in terms of being, surprised, no, not really. I thought Peace were going to win. That was obvious. Were they going to get enough to get an absolute majority? That's highly unusual. It never happened before in modern Poland. No one knew, and no one's really known until today, because you had to count the votes to see if the smaller parties would get in. If the left hadn't set up this coalition to go for an 8% threshold rather than a 5% threshold, Peace may not have got an overall majority. So it's not just because Peace have been terribly clever, it's because other people have made stupid miscalculations of one sort or the other. I don't know. I just think that when I was there in Warsaw when you had this first Peace government, then it was a coalition with, I think, if I'm right in saying, the Self-Defense Party and the League of Polish Families, two sort of populist Polish parties who no longer really exist. What Peace did then was very smart. When I came to Warsaw, Poland was just joining the EU, but you'd had a difficult referendum on joining the EU. You had Mr. Leper and roadblocks. There'd been a sort of sense of Zhirinovsky-type populism out there somewhere.
Without the orange juice.
Without the orange juice, a couple of years earlier. What the Kaczynskis did was bring these people in, and they were like sort of oranges, if I can use this metaphor. They sucked the juice out of the orange, the voting juice out of these oranges, and then threw away the skins. And so what they've done really very, I think, cleverly is bring the sort of popular protest vote into Peace itself. And if you look at the results, apart from Platform, where everyone else was an opposition voter, there's this Polish word some of you may know, some of you won't, called the układ. Układ is a funny sort of word meaning the setup, the establishment, the sort of the fix. There isn't really a word for it in English, but it's a negative thing. And Peace have been quite good, Law and Justice has been quite good at campaigning against the sort of the establishment, the setup, the liberal intelligentsia, the people who know best. And it's quite clear that...
So there's a dab of UKIP.
A big dab of UKIP, but there's a big dab of old Labour, there's a big dab of new Labour, and there's a big dab of Cameron. This is the point. They're very good at picking bits from different parts of the spectrum and presenting this as an opposition programme which is convincing. And if you ask me to guess, after 4 years in government, next time there's an election, they'll still be campaigning as the opposition because the układ has never gone away.
Annabelle, you're just fresh back from Poland, where you're based, of course, at the moment. Among the metropolitan elite, if you like, in Warsaw, which of course you don't know anything about, is there any sense of shock? Did some of them even secretly vote for Peace, for Law and Justice, or are some people that you know well actually declaring, yes, I did vote for Law and Justice?
Well, nobody that I know of course. I think it's not a shock because everyone saw it coming, sort of looming on the horizon. Then the win of Andrzej Duda in the presidential elections in May. So this was like a catastrophe waiting to happen, you could say, but no one was able to stop it at the same time. Do I know anyone who voted for Law and Justice? As I said, no, but there has been a change where before it used to be embarrassing to admit that one voted for Law and Justice or to vote for Law and Justice at all, whereas now it's kind of the other way around, that, as you were saying, among young people, Law and Justice has improved its image, and one of the ways it did this was with a massive offensive on social media, where they were several steps ahead of Civic Platform.
A bit like the Corbynites. How do you feel about the victory of Law and Justice, not just as an analyst, which of course you are, looking at the markets, and we'll come on to their fiscal program and what the ratings agencies think of it and so on. But as you know, this is your country. Do you think this is a good step for your country?
It's a choice of the voters. So whatever step they make, whatever choice they make, it's a democratic choice. I think that the shift in the preferences among the younger voters and generally in the voters reflects a wider trend in the European economies. Poland is very similar to Germany in many aspects, and one of them is that Polish economic success is based on cheap labor, suppression of wages, and actually a quite high share of national income going towards profits rather than the wages. Poland, I think, has a third lowest or fourth lowest share of GDP going to wages. So despite this very spectacular economic success, and Poland being the star of the economic transition that other countries in the region look with envy, it is based on an uneven distribution of that success. And I think that's visible in Germany, it's visible in Spain, it's visible in all the countries where the temporary contracts, so-called junk contracts in Poland, are prevalent, where wages haven't been growing. And paradoxically, in Europe, that has been more visible in countries that haven't actually experienced any crisis, more than the countries that have gone through the crisis. As a Polish voter, well, again, it's a democratic choice. I think it is also a possibly
Could
one
you
of
vote
those...
from abroad, by the way? I'm not going to ask you how you vote, but obviously Poland has, second only to the Irish, maybe massive diaspora around the world.
Yes.
So
and
you and your Polish friends here in London, they were able to vote?
There are, I think, 800,000 of us living in this country. So the Polish embassy was incredibly busy and was the last one to deliver the protocol of the vote yesterday. That's why the results were so delayed. Of course, yes, I voted. I think it's my citizen's duty.
Very good. Our second distinguished poll on the panel, Law and Justice's victory, Tremor or earthquake?
We don't know.
That's an academic's answer.
We honestly do not know, because the Law and Justice, as it's not unique in it, is a party of many faces. It is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And we don't know which one will come out in the next few days, few weeks. So depending on who will fill some critical posts, it will be either Tremor or it will be an earthquake.
How involved will, obviously, Kaczynski's a huge figure, but we think that Beata Szydło is going to be the Prime Minister. Do you think that will definitely happen? And if so, will she be her own woman, or will she really take orders from behind the scenes?
We don't know, again, because there are already quite a few signals that she may not be the Prime Minister, but I think she will. But I have no doubt whatsoever that the only power, or supreme power in the party, is Kaczynski. So it is not a good situation for a country with a democratic system where the person who is actually in charge is not on the public stage in the full light.
Is that your sense that Szydło the arrangement will be as Professor Kubik has suggested?
Well, I think we can draw parallels with 2005 when Law and Justice came to power 10 years ago. And there was a sort of technocratic prime minister, Kazimierz Szymart-Sienkiewicz, who lasted 8 months before Jarosław Kaczyński took over as prime minister. So people are speculating whether, even if Beata Szydło becomes prime minister now, how long she will last and how long it will be before Jarosław Kaczyński finds some pretext to remove her. Oh, she's not doing a good job, or oh, there's been a minor scandal or something.
Tell us about the Kaczynskis, Charles. Lech, of course, died tragically in the 2010 Smolensk air disaster. And now his twin brother, his identical twin brother, is very much the kingmaker, the ringmaster, if you like, of Polish politics. You've met both of them, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I wouldn't know Yaroslav quite as well as I did know Lech and his wife, who are very interesting. I mean, the thing that strikes me about them both is that they are incredibly smart. And by smart, I mean having a very big hard drive. So they can get up and make speeches with clauses, sub-clauses, sub-sub-clauses, go back to the next clause and do all this without notes, you know, which is technically very impressive. They've got a mastery of, they both had a mastery of briefs and information. So when I briefed Tony Blair came out to Warsaw just before before he stepped down as Prime Minister, before the Lisbon summit. You know, I told him and his people, you can be sure that at the meeting of European leaders, when they talk about the Lisbon Treaty, Lech Kaczynski will be not only the only one who's read it, he will be able to get up and give you a 4-hour lecture on it. And he will really understand what these details mean. No one else at the table will have that grasp of the information. So this is sort of impressive. I mean, it gives them a certain sort of edge. The other feeling, this may be controversial, I don't know what the Polish colleagues think, but you know, you have to rummage around in the solidarity period. There are all these different groupings in solidarity, personalities, people on one side or on the other. It's a very broad church, broad grouping. And I sort of felt back in 2005 that the Kaczynskis didn't, the pair of them, the sort of phenomenon of the Kaczynskis, they didn't so much want to win power. What they wanted was to be vindicated by history. Our view of this transition, where the thick black line they drew was a bit dodgy, too many weird deals were done by the communists. They wanted that position to be vindicated. And that if that meant you have to win power and you have to be president and prime minister, so be it. But I think things have probably moved on from there. And I think the fact that Mr. Duda has come in is quite interesting. He's a totally different sort of law and justice person. He's worked in the European Parliament. You know, he's been out of Poland, different sort of psychological type, I think, a lot younger. So my feeling is Jarosław Kaczynski now wants to build up a sort of base of young people, a sort of set of ideas which will last. He has a sort of systematic approach to things, which frankly is in complete distinction to anyone else, as far as I know, in Polish politics. I mean, the PO people just weren't like that. That's why they ended up in the mess they're in. So I think he's in quite a good position now. He can, if he starts attracting younger voters, you know, appealing to small businesses, coming up with some smart reforms which are a little bit outside the box for peace and what you'd be expecting. I think he's quite well placed now.
Let's move on to those reforms. You'll have noticed Fitch have said, okay, we'll maintain our positive rating on the Polish bond, but if some of these plans that Law and Justice and Peace have campaigned on actually are implemented, we may be minded to downgrade that slightly. What do you think of their fiscal plans as a market analyst?
Before we go to that,
Yeah,
just comment on what Charles said. We have to give it to Jarosław Kaczynski. He has been in opposition for 8 years. He lost 7 elections. And despite that, he managed to quell opposition within his own party, kick out the challengers, bring them back on their knees and his back, supporting him, and win the elections. I mean, that is a huge political talent.
And win the biggest majority ever in modern Poland.
Despite whatever you may think about the person, the quality of policies he pursues, the quality of policy making, and sometimes spoiling the quality of policy making, he's very
having lost his identical twin.
Yeah.
However, he does represent the old guard and the upbringing in the basis of the Warsaw Uprising, the so-called cursed soldiers, the idealistic policies, probably influenced very heavily by his mother. But he also learns, and he learned that putting Andrzej Duda ahead in front, putting Beata Szydło probably will win him the elections, and he did that. On the economic policies, in a sense, the campaign and the elections do represent some form of earthquake, because economic agenda has never been very important for the peace, for law and justice. It was always more about the national issues, identity, patriotism, moral aspects. The economic issues featured very prominently on the election agenda, but more on the populist side. And it got to almost extreme that PiS challenged the civic platform, which until now has been seen as the leader on economic issues, as the party that decides on economic policy, actually knows the stuff, to do something and come up with an idea for a tax reform, which is not too bad on its own, but requires very deep changes into how this country is set up. And
this banking tax, could it happen? That's been quite prominent.
So if we go by detail,
yeah.
I think a lot of this is just campaigning and is populism. It does reflect what people think and worry about. If really the source of the dissatisfaction of voters is from low income for the average Pole, because we have to remember that the median wage is about 2,200 Polish zloty, well below the average. So most people,
skewed income distribution.
It's a very skewed income distribution, especially for people who have who are salaried workers, not entrepreneurs. It addressed what people really wanted. However, the economic reality is not so friendly. Polish public finances are already very tight. The system of entitlements is very stiff. It's very hard to change them. That's why Poland actually didn't have a crisis in 2008, 2009, because there is all this automatic stabilizers and a lot of social spending built in the system. So it will be hard to implement all of those. Baby payments, for example, 500 zloty per each kid, second in richer families, not means tested. This is about 22 billion Polish zloty every year. Bank tax could maybe raise 5 if it doesn't create a distortion in the banking system, which would then lower those profits, lower those tax revenues. Massive investment outlays, higher spending for healthcare, higher spending for defense. It all adds up to between, depends how we count it, 50 to 100 billion Polish zloty. It's impossible to do it under the existing fiscal rules and within the existing economic reality.
Just if I may, there'll be quite a lot of people following this debate, foreign investors. There were some quite strong words spoken about foreign capital,
yes,
its prevalence in Poland. Is that necessarily a good thing? Do you think that's mainly rhetoric, or do you think we could see some kind of disfavour shown towards the massive FDI that has been a big part of the Polish success story?
Well, it is a part, as we talked about the labor market and the dissatisfied workers, this is also this part of that pendulum that's swinging in Central Eastern Europe. The time when Poland and Hungary, the countries entered the transition, was a time of enchantment with neoliberal agenda and very strong support for foreign capital. I think that has swung the other way, and people realize that it's not always the best of worlds to have such a large presence of foreign investors in some sectors. Again, probably yes, probably the government will try to pursue some of those promises. However, to buy out foreign investors will require quite large amounts of capital. This government has, the outgoing government has already supported higher ownership in the banking industry, but it's only PZU that actually has sufficient funds to buy out smaller banks, and it bought a share on Alior Bank, one of the smaller banks, and that's actually a small share. Otherwise, it will be very hard. These are large banks, and they are very profitable. So unless you do, let's say, controversial policy measures like in Hungary, which actually lowered the value of the banks because of the changes in legislation, and even then, there's been very little exit from the market. So again, economic reality limits how much that party can do.
Annabelle, during the campaign, let's just move on to other forms of policy. A lot of the campaigning coincided, of course, with a broader EU migrant crisis, and PiS really made hay with that. Not just opposing what Brussels was saying, but vehemently opposing. And Kaczynski said some pretty rough things about various migrants and their origins and their sanitary health and so on. PiS will want to show to their voters a quick victory over Brussels. Could we see Poland, perhaps, and Hungary forming a bloc in Eastern Europe that will really make Brussels' life difficult as it tries to cope with this migrant crisis?
I mean, what you say is true. The last 2 months of the campaign coincided with this migration crisis, and it worked to PiS's benefit. They would have won anyway. I think they would have won significantly all the same, but it certainly was bad timing for the Prime Minister, Ewa Kopacz, who sort of hesitated and then agreed to take them in and so on. But it didn't do her any favors either with the people who opposed migration or the ones who were pro-refugee. I don't know. I mean, we don't know whether peace will actually go ahead and challenge this acceptance of refugees, or whether it even-
7,000 migrants, I think the civic platform have agreed to, right?
I think that with some of these things, I think that Law and Justice's bark is worse than its bite. I think it mobilized this populism and used it in the campaign, but now they might sort of say that our hands are tied, we can't really do anything. That, you know, the decision is made, we oppose it, but it's too late.
But this is really big. I mean, for Brussels, Poland has been their beacon in Eastern Europe. Poland has used its economic and diplomatic muscle often to jostle its East European neighbours, both EU members and prospective EU members, into line on certain issues. Could that now change?
I think that it might not change so much at the actual policy-making level. It might just be a change in tone, more sort of pugnacious, you know, picking fights and so on. But I've been talking to different law and justice politicians involved in the European Parliament and so on, and they say, oh no, we don't want to mess up relations with Germany. We want better relations with Germany, ones based on true partnership. And for them, that means a more equal relationship, where Poland is also setting the rules. It's not just Germany saying what Poland should do.
How about relations with Moscow? How do you think they will change, if at all? Maybe there's a lot more spikiness towards Brussels, but maybe not so much difference between civic platform and law and justice when it comes to relations heading east.
I think it depends on how the internal field of forces within the party gets solidified. So there is a bit of a misconception. This is a large party. It is in a way a catch-all party, which has several sort of niches of electorate combined together. One of those is devoted to what these critics call the Smolensk religion, which is based on several beliefs that it was some kind of dirty trick played by the Russians. The version how it was done changed, I don't know how many times. Nobody can keep account anymore. But there's a sizable part of the electorate that believes that there was something there. It wasn't just an accident, that the official version is false. And for example, if Antoni Macierewicz, who was running the Parliamentary Commission investigation on this, ends up in the government in some prominent function, and he might, this issue will come to the fore, and that blocks any sensible conversation with the Russians right there. There are some elements in the party, on the other hand, that have this somewhat pro-Russian sentiment. It exists in the kind of Dmowski part of Polish field of political philosophies. So there is a tension. There's quite a tension there, and which one comes to the fore, again, it depends who will take which position in the government. So it's hard to predict, but by and large, you know, the relationship is, for obvious reasons, not very good to begin with. And Poland, under any government, was taking very strong pro-Ukrainian position. I think it will continue doing so. Of course, the argument may be, well, you know, we're not going to jump in our tanks and ride into Moscow and win this way. Eventually, we have to sit down and start talking to them. For some parts of the piece, this conversation is not going to be very difficult. For some, it is impossible.
Do you see any shift? Is it old Russia hand?
Well, not really. I think I agree with the professor there. I mean, what struck me about the previous East government, it was a lady called Mrs. Fotyga, who was the Polish foreign minister, who again was very smart, but I really had a strong sense she just didn't want that job. It wasn't her natural thing to be a networker, to be out there talking to people. And the sort of way they did things in those days was they would proclaim a policy. You know, you'd sit there, you'd write it, you'd get professors, experts, you'd come up with something really good, and you announce it. It's a bit like throwing a stone into a pond, big lump of rock. And it's impressive, but the water just flows around it. And so I think, you know, it doesn't matter, frankly, what your positions are on Ukraine or climate change or migrants or anything else. It's not enough to be smart. It's not enough to be strategic. It's not enough to be, you know, cunning. you've got to be effective, and you've got to be convincing, especially if you're dealing with European partners. And so the typical, I defer to my colleagues here, but my sense of the peace sort of intellectual base is they are not people who've spent a lot of time in Brussels. They're not people who've spent a lot of time internationally schmoozing in the city. That's not what they are. And so it's quite difficult to go to these EU meetings and be effective in that context. So that if they're smart, they will pick people who, one way or the other, can be at least reasonably convincing.
Well, maybe that shift towards the younger guard in peace will help, because after all, Poland has been a member of the EU since 2004.
Let's do that.
So you had 2 terms in the European Parliament, and actually quite some contacts already with the European diplomats. So that could help. If Mr. Kaczyński is smart enough to let the younger crowd run large aspects of international policy, he can put it in a more experienced, younger but more experienced hands.
Just while we're on relations with Brussels, I haven't read your, I'm sure it's excellent research notes that you've written today. Have you been following the debate on coal? Obviously, peace had a lot of electoral leverage among that particular lobby in Poland. Could we see them trying to defy Brussels by supporting the coal industry?
Well, previous government actually supported coal industry too. They, on the one hand, agreed to the cuts in coal emissions. On the other hand, didn't want to close the mines too quickly.
The rules say you can support if it's support to wind down.
So it's not changing much. I think the rhetoric is stronger, and peace is talking about actually negotiating treaties, also potentially disrupting the conference in Paris in December. And so that conflict probably was coming in some form or another, but given the type of rhetoric pursued by the party, it may be a stronger one.
I mean, can I just say something on this? If you're trying to work out, you folks, what the Kaczynski philosophy basically is, I will tell you, because I've heard them in private meetings and meetings of ambassadors say it lots of times. They play on the idea that Poland has been held back by Yalta, by communism, by whatever. Poland has not had a chance to take its place shaping modern Europe. So the liberal acquis on, abortion or marriage or divorce or whatever, which has built up in Europe, the sort of the human rights platform, which we now more or less take for granted, they say that's very interesting. We didn't have our chance to form that.
And they're devout Catholics, of course.
Well, more or less, but that's not the point. The point is they didn't have a chance to form it. And so whether it's on the economic side or the sort of social side or anything, they really feel that Poland is entitled to catch up. And then when it's caught up enough, we can then talk about some of these issues. So if closing mines and all these other things mean that our chance to catch up on our terms is being thwarted by the bureaucrats in Brussels, they will be very confident opposing that. And they won't care if Brussels doesn't like it. And they will, in a way, relish the fact that Brussels doesn't like it, because that will tell their core voters, we are standing up for Poland catching up. And I think that's a big, big sort of motif of what they...
And it will annoy Donald Tusk, of course.
Who knows? but it's a philosophical point, which is quite interesting. I mean, it's not something to be sneezed at. I think we in Western governments would look at all this stuff and say, yeah, but who cares? They really care about this. Do not underestimate the degree to which they care about the idea of Poland catching up on Poland's terms.
Annabelle?
I think I can really echo that, because on Sunday night I went to the Law and Justice election party where the votes were announced and so on. And before the results came out, everyone was sort of mingling and in very good spirits and so on. And I heard someone say, well, finally now Poland's golden age is going to begin. Whereas, The Economist last year, I think, had a cover which said, Poland's golden age, and it was referring to probably the past 7 years, or now 8 years, of law and justice government, of a civic platform government. Whereas for these people who have returned to power now, it's only just beginning on Poland's terms.
How do you see relations with Brussels before we come on to the UK's the impact on the UK of all this?
Well, let me say something about this catching up. I am not sure if it is the whole story, because catching up assumes that you are aspiring to the model where you are going. So it would have to mean that the Kaczynski thinks, oh, this is Europe the way it is, and we need to catch up to it. So it is maybe, sometimes they say it, but there's quite another layer of rhetoric or another area of rhetoric which is completely different. Is directed to more traditional electorate of Radio Maria, very traditionalist, older, usually part of the Catholic Church. And the argument is, we don't want to, we don't need to catch up. We are our own culture, we are our own civilization. We are going to be growing, developing according to our own logic. And this is another part of this electorate. Again, whether this philosophy, if you may call it this way, is going to be the dominant philosophy of the government, we simply do not know. I suspect it will not. But in order to keep this part of the electorate behind them, they have to, from time to time, make a nod to them by producing some symbolic gestures. How is it going to play in Brussels? I think that much of the commentary is a bit hysterical. Quite a few European newspapers announced that there's going to be some major problem because Brussels is more liberal, cosmopolitan, and here is this bunch of strange people coming from Eastern Europe who are much more chauvinistic, nationalistic, anti-gay, pro-life, not pro-choice, and so on. It is not going to be like that. It is going to be more complicated. The genius, and I completely agree, of Kaczynski's political career is that he can play on two pianos, several pianos at the same time, and he's able to send different signals to different people. Of course, the situation at some point in some meetings in Brussels or in bilateral meetings, he will have to play on one piano from time to time, right? If he is going to be the one who will be at the piano at the moment. Again, this depends who will be fronting the whole business, and we don't know.
Mr. Orban has been very successful in that. He delivers one
In
message.
Hungary.
Yes, he delivers one message to the Hungarians. He delivers another message to the Europeans in Brussels. He delivers a different message to the markets, and he manages all of that. And Mr. Kaczynski likes Mr. Orban.
But there's a big philosophical
Good
difference
mind.
between
Yes.
law and justice and Jobbik, right?
Yes, and
Oh,
sorry,
yes.
and
But
Fidesz
Fidesz,
and Jobbik.
Jobbik is-
Though it has been done, so Mr. Orban has set a precedent in Central Eastern Europe, and you also have to remember that the EU is very busy with other things right now. It's about saving the union, reforming the periphery, deciding on German leadership in the EU. Hungary, of course, is a much smaller country. It's not as important in the regional political leadership, but Poland is a different weight of a player.
But if I may very quickly, because the difference is that Poland doesn't have an equivalent of Jobbik.
That's
The
very small,
part
very
of very
tiny,
small,
yeah.
so it is a sizable sort of outflanking to the right of Fidesz in Hungary. And if you talk to Fidesz people, they often say, look, we really don't need to be that right wing, but we have to, because if it's not us, it's Jobbik. This maneuver doesn't work in Poland because there's not a real force outflanking Kaczynski on the right.
Just before we move on to UK and questions and so on, while we've got such an expert panel here, I just wanted to ask you briefly about the smaller parties, which of course do have collectively quite a big proportion of the electorate. If you think the two main parties got 40 and 24 between them. Charles, in your excellent piece in the Telegraph today, I don't know why you write for such a newspaper.
They pay. not much. Any port in a storm, yeah.
I've been following the Richard Petru, the former World Bank economist, who's obviously become very active in Polish politics. You described one of the party leaders who now I think controls 7 or 8% of as the equivalent of Brian May, the lead guitarist of Queen, entering Parliament.
Cookies.
Oh.
Can I just get your, with such experience and knowledge here, I just wanted to get your reflections on the smaller parties, which even in an amazing publication like BNE with Annabelle and all our other talented correspondents may not get as much airplay. So just if you could give us your impression.
Well, I don't know this. I've never done anything. I mean, I'm a bit out of date now, to be honest. I mean, I go to Poland quite often, but I don't really follow it deeply. So I'm not really familiar with the Cookies. Mr. Cookies was a former, or indeed a current, pop star of some sort who basically rose to prominence campaigning in favour of the British electoral system. Now, there may be
First past the post.
First past the post, because he said, look at the British election system, you can get rid of people. You know, Ed Bull's gone. You know, how do we get rid of Leszek Miller and all these terrible people who just never go away? And it turns out, under the Polish system, these people have now gone. So, but he rose to prominence on that, basically that single issue vote, and just struggled to turn that into a party. I mean, there's this thing called the Peasants' Party, PSL, who for no reason I can put my finger on, always just seem to get into Parliament. And quite how they are appealing to these folk, I don't know. Why Peace haven't sort of absorbed them, I don't know, but there they are. They always get in. The amazing thing really is the left, the former communist left, just have vanished completely, which is a big change in terms of who will be on the news chat shows every night. But it's really depressing, I think, for Platformer that the Petru Party have got 7% campaigning on core, a sort of free market, you know, platform of some sort. I mean, you know, the Platformer has lost those votes to some guy saying, come on, you people are simply not doing a good enough job. It's very, very damaging. And so you can imagine at the next election, Platformer, I mean, I defer to the experts again, but it could have completely fragmented. You could have a Petru Party coming along with a much stronger pro-European market, but a market policy. Cookies will have, you know, become some whatever. I think Platformer's in a difficult position now because no one really knows what it stands for, including Platformer.
Is Cookies a proper pop star, or I mean, is he on your iPod?
I mean, when I was writing about the presidential elections, I was sort of like, okay, keep writing about this Cookies person, but what did he actually sing? Yeah. You know, so put him into YouTube and sort of. Yeah.
No, but I have to disagree. Actually, Cookies is a good singer. I sometimes play.
She likes the old stuff
on my iPod. But if you look at the Polish elections, there's always been this high support for alternative first-timers. Stan Tymiński, if anybody remembers, in the first presidential elections.
Hard to forget.
Yes, with the black case. Then Palikot in the previous elections, again, protest vote, progressive, younger people. 10% voted for Palikot last time. Now 7-8% voted for Cookies. Then Samobrona, the kind of radical, again, fresh force. So there is always that residual voter in Poland that will vote for that part of the type of maybe you can.
But these aren't fringe parties. These are controlling 6, 7, 8. You've got the results here.
And they tend to disappear over the course
they pop up and then they go away again. Yeah.
Because then you have to do actual policy making, and they're usually inexperienced or unable to actually build a strong enough force to continue the policies.
How important are the fringe part? Well, I wouldn't call them that. Just to say, obviously, Law and Justice haven't got enough to change the constitution. But if they got together with some of these smaller parties with high single-digit numbers, then they could, if it came to that. If there was a big kind of schism with Brussels.
Well, they cannot get a few of them because they're very different. And this protest vote that is indeed has been always there comes from each election, different part of Polish society decides to protest vote. So this time those were young people, and someone I work with on the project was spending a lot of time around the presidential election interviewing those young people, asking them, so what is it that you really want? And this is a very good social scientist. So I called him 2 days ago and I said, so what did you learn? What did they really want? And he says, I have no clue. They are not producing any coherent narrative. They just do not like anything. They just don't want this party, that party, nothing. They just are against, and against. And this former heavy metal sort of rock and roll star that turned to be very religious, and he was singing totally against the church years ago. Now he is singing with the church.
No, is he rock and roll or punk or heavy metal? I've got to get this straight.
So punk rock.
Oh, okay.
He did a concert here on Saturday, actually, in London.
Oh, so that's we need to go.
He did one.
Yeah, I mean, I can
So
just
when
elaborate.
the votes were being counted,
No,
he
no,
was
no,
here
no,
doing
no.
a concert.
Because in Poland, they had 24 hours of election silence just before the vote, so that was all of Saturday. And in
Right.
Poland, you can't campaign, but
Right.
outside Poland, you can. So he did a free concert in London.
I missed it.
300 people. I was watching it.
No way. I don't know.
And-
I was looking at the economic statistics. It was a mistake.
Just this might be of interest to people here. This cookies person, he got 54% among British Poles in the presidential election. So Poles living in the UK. It's a
Well,
big,
yeah.
big constituency.
Well,
Which is-
cookies is like
yeah.
Donald Trump without money. Because you cannot figure out what it is all
With
about.
longer-
Also, George Bush Jr. a little bit. Star, drinking, using drugs,
Coke habit.
turning them to church, having a life experience that kind of turned him back to the more traditional ways of thinking.
No, I will say something I thought I would never say. George Bush was more articulate than cookies. Really. You know,
That's the headline. Ladies and gentlemen, do put your hands up if you want to participate in the debate. You're more than welcome. I was just going to start talking about a subject which the Daily Mail went big on today, which is the impact of the election debate in the election outcome in Poland, potentially on David Cameron's renegotiation. I'll ask the only other full Brit, if you like, on the panel to kick off. How do you see this, Charles? Might it be that if you've got a previously very pro-European country actually now pushing for more sovereignty, more flexibility in its relationship with Brussels, and doing so credibly with a mandate to do so, could that help our Prime Minister?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's not as if Poland is not pro-Europe under current management. It's just a different way of looking at Europe. I mean, if you offered to say, look, why don't we change the EU so it's more like it was 18 years ago in terms of the powers, Poland would probably say fine, and maybe Cameron would say fine. The problem I frankly have in all this is knowing quite what our policy is. You know, because it's one thing, because there's a paradox in all this. I do sort of negotiation theory, and if you ask for a lot, do you overbid in the hope, do you ask for 100 in the hope of getting 60? You know, part of the reason we don't know what it is the Brits want is because you daren't say so. Because if you say what you want, everyone attacks it. But then the problem with not saying so is everyone doesn't know where you stand. So they're sort of, they seem to
Well,
be
if you
caught.
say so, anything it can be judged, you can be seen as a
It's
failure
never
if
enough.
you don't quite get
Well,
it.
plus it's never enough
That's
because
right.
the Eurosceptics will say, why are you just asking for this? Basically, my view is very simple. You know, Poland was a communist prison camp for 50 years. The fact that you can now get on a bus, wave an ID card, turn up in Victoria Station is a stunning thing for everyone in Poland. They just couldn't believe it when I went in to tell them we will accept free movement of Poles, free movement of workers without qualification. They simply didn't believe that could happen. So for us to say, well, actually, we didn't mean it now, and you can't take that back. I think that's gone. But what you can take back are all sorts of powers which Tony Blair gave away at the Lisbon Treaty discussions. There are all sorts of ways you could recalibrate the balance between Brussels and nation states in a way that I would have thought peace would be very happy with, and David Cameron might be pretty happy with. Whether or not the British voters would then vote for that is a different matter. I mean, that's a sort of completely different thing. I would have thought there's potentially quite a lot of common ground, but if you pitch the issue in terms of there are too many Poles in the UK, Warsaw will just not be happy with you. They won't agree to that because they'd be mad to do so.
And of course, one of Cameron's centrepiece reforms, at least the words that the backbenchers, Bernard Jenkin and co, the Eurosceptics want to put in his mouth, is that he doesn't like the idea of child benefit being paid here to people in other countries. I mean, is this a live issue in Poland, in your experience, Annabelle, given the number of Poles who are here and sending money back?
I think that maybe from a different perspective, the question of immigration was a huge in the campaign, in the presidential one, and also now in the parliamentary one. How can the main parties stop young people from leaving? there were proposals. Law and Justice has some employment program where it plans to create over 1 million jobs over 10 years. We'll see how that works out and so on. So I think that was the bigger issue rather than the benefits. But if you speak to people inside Law and Justice, they're sort of very positive about the British-Polish relationship. They have big expectations on David Cameron, a lot of admiration, and they hope that this will be mutual.
So can I just say one thing? I meant to say it before, but forgot. When I was in Warsaw, it must have been about 2006-07, there was a terrific interview with Jarosław Kaczynski and Rzeczpospolita, one of the big newspapers. I mean, very long, one of these Polish interviews. They really go on for 10 pages. But buried deep in that, if you went into it, he started talking about the common agricultural policy. And you would have thought, great, money for Polish farmers. That's what we want. He actually said, we must be careful we do not get hooked on benefits. So this is what I mean by thinking outside the box. He's often a step ahead. So when you work, when you say Poland is pro-Europe or anti-Europe, it's not really, frankly, I'm not saying you, but it's not capturing the subtlety of what's going on. There is a lot to play for. I've always thought personally that David Cameron was hoping, because of the Eurozone crisis and all the other crises, that Europe would have to reform regardless of the British position, and that under cover of that general chaos, we could renegotiate a new deal. But the driving force of that reform would be Europe itself realizing that Europe in its current format doesn't work. And that's fine if it happens. But if it doesn't happen and the days are ticking by and it doesn't seem to be quite happening, then you end up in quite a difficult position where your demands are either big enough or strong enough or convincing enough or simply achievable enough to impress British voters. And what peace will make of this, I think they'll just actually find it quite amusing. They will be happy to help him if they think he's going to go somewhere, but I think they'll also be happy to drop him like a hot potato if he looks like he's going to mess up.
What's your view on this, Magda?
No, they are pragmatic, right? So, and definitely, Mr. Kaczynski has something you would call a historic education. So, regardless of what you may think about his policy stance and everything else, he definitely has that deeper perspective on issues than, say, a young, hungry wolf in Polish politics, thinking about various issues, or on the common agriculture policy, what the PSL has traditionally thought.
What's your perspective on Britain, the EU, the potential impact of what we've seen in Poland?
Well, I have some kind of background thoughts about all of this. One is this relationship may work. Those are two places, two countries, parts of the elites are interested in redefining EU. That may be true, and there are some serious sort of more conservative, say, maybe not, well, in the sense, right-wing think tanks in Poland that are doing a lot of work on that. So that may be something quite interesting, and that will be somewhat similar to what Cameron is trying to do, if we can figure out what he's trying to do. But the question of economic policy, they are completely worlds apart, right? The Tories are roughly neoliberal, whatever it means. Kaczynski is socialist. So this is not, on this, they are not going to find common language. Maybe they don't need to negotiate European identity. But here's the thing, the party piece is very close to the Catholic Church, particularly its more conservative traditionalist wing. And the church, in my judgment, is beginning to suffer from the very low level of education of its priests, particularly the higher levels. The things that the bishops are saying, some key members of the episcopate, is sometimes just, you kind of cringe that, this may come from someone who is supposed to be a seriously well-educated person. Often, this part of the church, which is not insignificant, sends the signal that we have nothing to do with the Europe as it is today, because it is a corrupted, wrong version of Europe that needs to be repaired, and the repair must come from, say, a country like Poland, which carries true, clear European vision, somehow centered around Catholicism, right? So, a specific interpretation. So this tension will come to the fore, no doubt, because particularly Radio Maria and Father Rizek will come and say, hey, look, we really supported you very strongly. Several other publications, the TV station Tremor, I continue to exist, however you translate it. And this is a debt to be repaid. So I don't know how they're going to play it. It is very complicated. They have to show, again, as you said, different faces to different partners, so to speak.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming towards the end of our time. Do put your hand up if you want to. Okay, there's a.
Just a little bit on the potential for Poland to become more protectionist, particularly what you touched. The potential for Poland to become more protectionist. You touched on kind of FDI and what that meant, but in addition to the bank laws, there's also been retail laws floated as well, and how that feeds in with their general aspirations for the Polish consumer, and is there a risk that they end up trying to give to the Polish consumer on the one hand and then take it away on the other because they've changed sort of industry structures that actually provide quite a good service to consumers today?
Well, any government in Europe is limited in how protectionist it can become because of the European rules on free trade and free flow of capital. So it's very hard to actually limit these financial or trade flows. When it comes to FDI, the previous government has already started becoming more selective. For example, in the banking sector, actually it was not a free-for-all. It was a very selective process for who can purchase Polish banks in terms of capital, sources of money, location of the investor. It's not an accident that not a single rational investor has ever bought any strategic assets in Poland, or an investor based in Cyprus, for the matter. So this would be rather a continuation of that policy. But indeed, in some strategic sectors, the government may try to support higher Polish investment, high presence. But again, there is a hard budget constraint. And without some radical changes in the way Polish economy is financed, it would be very hard to suddenly come up with large amounts of capital to, say, buy out one of the foreign banks or buy a large utility provider. Not to mention then the investment outlays that are needed in the energy sector that then you have to come up with.
You've been covering this, Annabelle. I mean, if maybe a lot of it is rhetoric, maybe the notion of tackling or discriminating against foreign capital was just an election ploy.
Magdalena knows better about these things, but I think it's striking that it's this populist, sort of stubborn, we don't want the foreigners in here. I mean, I went to a press conference where Jarosław Kaczyński and peace people were talking about agricultural land. They have something about trying to make it more difficult for foreigners to use or buy agricultural land. And that was a clear populist move to attract the peasant vote before the elections, because there's this competition between law and justice and the peasant population.
And in this area, it may be easier actually to implement because it involves small amounts of money, something that the Polish investors and farmers can actually sum on. But the largest projects, it's still hard for Polish investors. It would be actually a very good thing for Polish economy to have more domestically driven investment and more domestically driven innovation. And you do have that starting already. You have some centers of excellence, more innovation happening in a particular region, and different type of investments. There are fewer and fewer factories being built in Poland. There's more of companies like Google or Intel or banks or others transferring the technologies. This involves small amounts of money, but can also then help drive that domestically driven Polish investment.
Well, instead of going to Kukiz's concert, as I said, I was poring over some statistics, Eurostat and others. And I learned a few things that I didn't know or forgot. And one of them is, so PiS was running part of the campaign for a while that PO destroyed Polish industry. But there's deindustrialization in Poland. And when they come to power, they will reindustrialize Poland. So I started looking at the numbers. The contribution of industry to GDP in Poland is 8% higher than EU average. So, you know,
and how did it change during civic platforms, the incumbency?
That I don't know.
I think it's actually been fairly stable.
Fairly stable.
Yes.
But it is, it's a fact that, but of course, the viability of this industry depends on investment, and that I think you're right that Poland doesn't have enough of it. But the attempts to innovate, we have at sea someone who works on that, and Poland is sort of so-so according to this group that study the level of innovativeness in Eastern Europe. So-so. It's like in many other
Which is a massive underachievement given the level of technical
Yes.
and technological ability in education, right?
But it is not the deindustrialized, it's not, the place where it's kind of completely, I don't know, doing financial services or other kinds of services. That is not true. And of course, Polish agriculture is a powerful machine generating still a lot of income by exporting stuff.
There's a question here from the gentleman at the front.
I'll go on about that.
Okay.
I'm Simon Lishnikov from International Relations Department of the London School of Economics. I have a quick diplomatic question for the diplomats and people here at the panel. Thank you so much for the host, Liam. On the 27th of January last year, there was a huge celebration of liberation of Auschwitz in Poland. And when the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland was asked why Mr. President of Russian Federation was never invited for the celebration, the answer was that it was not Russia and was not Soviet Union who liberated the Auschwitz, but it was the first Ukrainian front, therefore Ukrainian people who liberated the Auschwitz. But we understand it's a very technologically sophisticated answer, meaning that it was just a matter of direction of the front, not the national part of the front that liberated it. So my question is, last year Henry Kissinger said that Ukraine should be a bridge between Europe and East. And the same argument really applies to Poland because of its geographical location. Do you think the issues of morality and respect are out of diplomacy these days? Or do we still have a hope that with the new Polish power, there is a hope for those things to be seen in diplomacy? Thank you.
Okay, good question to end on. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first because I sat there at Auschwitz in 2005 on the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and I didn't sit. I was able to stand, and it was rather good because it was -7, so I could walk around a bit because at the front was sitting Mr. Putin, was sitting Mr. Chirac, was sitting Dick Cheney, Bartoszewski, And Putin's speech then, I thought, was actually awful, and I've written about it in my book on public speaking. Not because it was a bad speech. It's just that if you're at Auschwitz, and Putin is here, right? And there, where that lady in the blue dress is sitting, are Auschwitz survivors. Who are 90 and it's -6 and they've been sitting there for 3 hours. Your speech is not about you. It's about them. And he made a speech about double standards and terrorism. And come on, the Soviet Union did not liberate Auschwitz. It kicked the Nazis out of Auschwitz and turned it into another camp. And, and it turned Poland into a camp. So, a little bit of morality on that side from the Russian end of the spectrum, I think would be quite welcome. I think these things are difficult, and the sense of history and the sense of Poland and Russia crunching up against each other, it comes and goes, but it's been going on for the last, 600 years, and it'll probably carry on for a few more weeks. It's not going to stop just because it doesn't. And I think the tone on both sides and the Smolensk issue, which we've referred to, can be tuned up or tuned down. And you can tune it up, and then having tuned it up, you can then say, right, we've made a breakthrough, and then you can use the fact that you've tuned it up to, build some bridges. So, morality, doesn't go away in diplomacy, but it's not the only factor. And I think if you look at the symbolism of something like Auschwitz and how that is handled at successive anniversaries, it's fundamentally a barometer of, of the relationship. And if you look at the famous letter Putin sent to the Poles over the you remember at the start of the First World War, that Putin's letter to the Poles. I analysed that extensively on the internet. The way Putin phrased that letter to the Poles was very, very tricky, frankly. And he presented a lot of things in a very liberal tone when fundamentally they were Soviet talking points. And I think, it takes two to tango in all this. And I think there's scope, if Mr. Duda is up to this, and it's going to take him a year or two to get up to speed, to be able to be quite good at this, but don't expect it immediately.
Okay, I'm going to give the last word, if I may, to Annabelle, and then we're going to carry on over a drink. Is that okay? Or do you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to say something about that. Very quickly.
Yeah.
I think that of course, without going into the complex Polish-Russian relations, the context of the January 27 was very important. Right? It was after the Russian invasion of Crimea and messing up things in the east of Ukraine. It was a tough moment, right? And then what was said, you're absolutely right. But what is really important is that it started quite a debate in Poland. And the debate was very open, and there was a lot of criticism of that statement. It wasn't like everybody said, "Oh, this is something they said it wasn't the Ukrainians, not the Russian." People who know something about it. It was the name, as you said, of the front, and the people who were in the army of this part were from all over the Soviet Union. So there were some Ukrainians, but there were of course others. So this debate happened, and I think. This statement was, in my personal judgment, unfortunate, but the tension was provoked by what Russia did in Ukraine, obviously.
No, just to finish, I think that's an example of one of these spats that there probably will be quite a lot of now when law and justice is in power, like before. But I don't think that really affects the kind of long-term fundamental diplomacy in relation with Russia. There will be more of these. Kaczynski said something sort of provocative about Germany, or what he said about Sharia law in Sweden recently, and the media picks it up, but it doesn't really alter Poland's position on fundamental things.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank, in particular, Henry Kirby, as I said, and also my colleague Simona Mitsukaite and Mariam and CAS Business School. I'd also like to thank the 30 or so correspondents who write for BNE, some of whom will be watching this on the telecast, and in particular Annabelle Chapman, who's come over from Warsaw. Do keep reading our magazine. Do keep looking at the website www.bne.eu, and do turn up to our next debate, ladies and gentlemen, which will be on Tuesday, the 24th of November, at the Citadines Hotel in High Holborn in London on Turkey, which may now. All it remains for me to say is to thank you for coming. Do stay with us and have a drink and carry on the discussion. And please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. Yeah, can we just get a photo?
You want us to sit?
Nie popatrzyliśmy w czarno-białe.
I też nie gadaliśmy tylko dokładnie tam 5
We need a landscape portrait one as well, yeah? Okay, we can just carry on interacting. Yeah.
Someone brings the wine here.
No, we will do that. Thank you very much for coming. Yes. A lot of people watch our stuff online.
Ambassador to Moscow. I should have got a nitrogen if I went there. I've been rather close.
I just remember being you in '94 at Sofia.
I wasn't ambassador then either.
You were politics secretary? Yeah.
Bilateral councillor.
No, I just remember you being incredibly